9 years I chased Olivia. 9 years, can it be? Dortmund, Kiel, La Paz, La Serena, Fortaleza. Then weeks ago I found myself driving east down Route 522 in the lower part of a state I'd never been to, until it became Ocean Boulevard. At 10 o'clock at night everything was lit up, all the miniature golf courses, the seafood restaurants, the donut shops, the t-shirt stores, Dairy Queen, Sensations, Ronnie's Beach Shack, the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. Traffic was light. It was 20 degrees outside. I took a right onto 3rd Street and cruised through a scruffy, quiet, sandy neighborhood 6 blocks from the beach. Crooked houses with names like Sea Swept, Starfish Cove, August House. Rooms with kitchenettes available by the week. See you next May. I parked the car and texted Binky I was here, and he answered in 5 seconds. I walked to 6th Street and got inside his pickup truck. For the last time, I said, "How do you know it's her?" And he said she hadn't moved from the house in 2 days and 2 nights. Who else would she be? The information was reliable. He'd slept maybe 6 hours in all that time. From that moment on, we would each do a shift. The spot that Binky had chosen was a clever one, screened in 2 directions by trees, and a trailer park beside the neighborhood. I sent him off to go eat pancakes and check into the Spindrift Inn, $44 a night, and had pulled into the space 10 minutes after he left. And I watched the house, and watched it for 11 hours. Olivia did not come out. When my shift was over, I walked the boardwalk, watched the people who still found something beautiful here in wintertime. I drifted through the souvenir shops that had stayed open, and I ate pizza. But I never stayed out for more than 2 hours, and never at night. At night, I parked on Cross Key Street and watched what I could of the house from the other side of it. Twice the lights went on late at night, and Binky and I talked over the radio, ready to move. But we didn't have to. On the 3rd night, Binky called me and told me she was leaving the house. Right through the front door she went, and went on foot down 6th Street toward the west end of town. She wore a baggy t-shirt and old jeans. I started the car and looped around toward Jones Avenue and parked the car about a mile down, and I waited. Against my wishes, Binky set out on foot, all 300 pounds of him. I told him that if he got closer than 3 blocks, she would know, and he told me not to worry. There was only so much we could do. But then Binky saw her. She'd gone north. He told me she was walking across a park, some connected athletic fields that served the year-round residents. I told him to not even update me until something actually happened. 20 minutes went by. Every 3 minutes or so he would tap his handset, just to let me know he was still there, and nothing had changed. At 1:15 he said there was someone else in the park, and she was slowly walking toward him. "Let her go," I said. "You can't get any closer. This is how we'll find out if it's her." "Some man walking his dog," he said, but he could barely see. They were both so far away now. Finally, I told him to just walk away, leave, go back to the house. "You want me to break in, look around?" he said, but no. She was more clever than that. She would have a fake ID under the name of the supposed renter and leave evidence of a normal vacationer. We'd find out nothing. We saw her return 2 hours later, both of us sitting in his pickup truck. Her hair was blonde, done up in a ponytail. The body didn't seem right somehow. I had a bad feeling. Binky had a police scanner, and at a little past 5 came the chatter we were waiting for. They'd found a body. That was all we needed. It was the first homicide in Brevard Beach in 14 years. Adrenaline surged through me. Binky just stared into space, scratching his huge beard with both hands, contemplating. All we needed was time to wait her out. The next time she left that house would be the last time. 4 days, 4 long days. I watched the house, drank at the Green Turtle, slept at the Budget Inn near Captain D's, ate subs from Mario's Snack Shack, walked the boardwalk back and forth, rode the Ferris wheel once it was still open, looked down on the town to see if I could see 6th Street. Couldn't, though. It was on the night I got drunk that she emerged again. Stupid. Stupid. So drunk I blacked out. So drunk I fell asleep against the side of a beach umbrella rental hut. Abandoned since September. Right out there on the sand. A remorseful, suicidal binge. The crackling of the radio woke me up. Jesus Christ, Binky was saying, where are you? She's moving. He was on Haven Avenue watching her through binoculars as she walked onto the beach at 5:51 a.m. I looked off to my left. It was still full dark. The cheap hotels were lit up and glowing all along the boardwalk behind me. I staggered to my feet and told Binky that if she went south, I would be waiting for her. He asked me if I would be ready, and I told him yes. I had what I needed. I always had what I needed. I moved around to the other side of the shack, screened off from view. God, it was cold. I peered around it and looked at the waves crashing on the beach. Yes, she was smart. The lights didn't reach that far, and everything from the boardwalk would just seem a field of black until dawn. Binky radioed me that she was going south. I was 8 blocks away. She had maybe 45 minutes before she'd have to be back in the house. What's she doing? I asked him. And Binky said, I think she's just watching the waves. She eventually got to me and moved beyond me. Her hair was untied now. She faced the ocean as she walked, careful not to get too close to the surf. No coat. When a tiny sliver of blue cracked the sky, I shut off my radio and left my spot. I was going to end everything now, one way or another. And it really was sadness I felt as I walked across the sand, trailing her, because she didn't know I was there. She should have known, but she didn't. And that meant she was almost done. She had very little left of what she was. The fact that she was out this late, that's what made it so obvious. Soon there was just enough gray light on the beach to make out the back of her t-shirt. Hammerhead Seafood, it said. Best lobster at the beach. She wouldn't have eaten there. Before Binky had arrived in town, she must have bought that shirt from the gift shop, just to have it. On some night when she'd gone walking down the boardwalk past the arcade and the old-time photos booth and Dippin' Dots. Even when I began to run, she didn't turn. I was within 5 steps of her when she finally did. A look on her face, not of surprise, but of mild curiosity. When I slammed into her, I caught a whiff of her perfume. I spent weeks trying to find out what it was as that memory faded. Princess by Vera Wang. She crashed to the sand, facing upwards, exactly as I needed her to be. And I fell on top of her. And I had the stake out in half a second. And I raised it high above my head, and she thrust her hands up, breaking my nose as she snarled. But every bit of my strength was with me, and the stake came down exactly twice, ending a story that maybe one day I'll tell at the bar during happy hour at Pirate's Launch on 9th Street. Painfully drunk, sunburned, wearing sandals and shorts in the heat. A beach bum, still pining for a tall blonde who broke his mortal heart from afar long ago. But finally got what she deserved. In my mind, the Lyra forest will always be associated with images of fire. But you can pick your awful story. There are 3 that I tell to people who don't know the forest.
In 2007, a young woman was walking near the South Ridge, near French Isle, and admiring this little stretch of wildflowers when she leaned in and noticed one that was obviously made of plastic, camouflaged cleverly in with the others you'd never even notice, really, out there deep in the woods. She took a cute picture of it for Facebook. One of her Facebook friends was her uncle, a police detective from Fairless County. When he saw that thin plastic geranium in the photo snuggling between all the real ones, something in his mind clicked immediately, and he drove out there the very next day, after asking his niece where exactly she'd been on the ridge. It took him an hour or so to find those wildflowers, but he did it, and he pulled out that plastic one that looked so much like the others, and he rooted around in the soil below it. See, 4 years before, he'd been one of the people who'd searched the house of a grain elevator operator named Dieter Forisch, when the police were sure they'd found the man who'd strangled and stabbed 12 people in Fairless County since 2004, the worst serial killer in the state's history. He'd write letters to police every 6 months or so, taunting them, claiming he picked people totally at random. They'd never recovered a single one of the victims. They'd finally tracked Forisch down in his house. He'd committed suicide. One of the odd things in there was a little collection of mismatched plastic flowers, lying on a work table, collected or bought from various unknown sources, even fake weeds. That was all it had taken to ring a little bell in this detective's mind 3 years after that day. That had stuck with him. Buried in the soil beneath the plastic geranium in the Lyra forest was a box of Altoids, and in it, instead of mints, was a very small assemblage of what turned out to be charred human remains. The forest was immediately closed to hikers for 2 weeks for the big search. Imagine dozens of police scouring 30,000 acres of woods looking for single plastic flowers among all that beautiful foliage around them. In the end, they found 6. A fake lily among some others near Moonscape Rock, a plastic wake robin out near the Bull Terrace Hills, that sort of thing. Painted just so. Each marked the site of another rusty box of Altoids. Forisch must have found the size just perfect. All the charred remains were from different victims, just enough of them packed into mince boxes to mark special spots in the forest that he could visit whenever he liked and stand there and relive what he'd done to them as he'd stalked people all around the quiet county and experienced that mental rush of remembering. The whole forest was his to walk and place his flowers that almost no one would ever even notice. 6 boxes in all, but that still left a lot of victims. And the thinking is they just had to stop searching at some point. The rest of the boxes are either out there somewhere still, or maybe the others just don't really exist.
Going back to 1981, there was the Clevitt case. Barry and Vivian Clevitt, wealthy couple. He was an engineer, she ran a dance studio. Wealthy but troubled. He had lost a lot of money in a terrible investment, and she'd been denying an affair.
On the 10th day of spring, they went for a walk down the western run, a pretty straight 6-mile shot through the trees that got almost no foot traffic that day because it was quite cold and gray and bleak. Barry Clevitt told this story, which he never changed or recanted. They'd been walking along for some time, talking, and at one point they'd fallen quiet, as people do when they hike. It had been very windy. A couple of minutes later, he turned to Vivian. They'd just been approaching the old stream crossing at the midpoint of the western run, and she was gone. Just like that. Gone. He'd called out, again and again, searched everywhere. She never turned up, ever. Vanished into the forest. He stumbled out of there near dusk. He could barely speak because his throat was so sore from yelling out for his wife. Right away, the thinking was murder. Someone can't just vanish from someone's side like that. He'd killed her, surely. And yet no body, no evidence. Police analysis of what remained of her footprints didn't tell them much after all those windy and dry conditions. No signs of a struggle. And the strangest thing was that Barry didn't claim that they had separated at some point, or she'd gone off after an argument or to explore something. He never flinched from his claim that she'd been beside him all that time until she simply wasn't. The sounds of her footsteps may be stifled by the wind. So this was actually the first time the Lyra forest had been thoroughly searched by the police, some 25 years before the Dieter Forisch case. Charges were eventually brought, and the prosecution argued that Barry had killed his wife right there, near the Midway stream crossing, carried her out, running the risk of being spotted, put her into the car, and wrapped her body even before that to keep any hair or clothing fibers from getting anywhere. In the absence of blood or eyewitnesses, what else could have happened? Barry's lawyer was very good, and in the end, split jury. Barry moved all the way across the country, to Arizona to live with his brother and disappear from the public eye. But a lot of people never stopped trying to figure out the case of Vivian Clevitt, the woman who disappeared without a trace from her husband's side. Sometime past midnight on Christmas Eve, 1986, the Tarker County Fire Department was called because a sky gazer all the way in LeClaire spotted 2 trees on fire near the western run. The tops of 2 birches were burning against the night sky. They couldn't be gotten to for a full 20 minutes, but the fire never worked its way down from the uppermost forked branches pointing directly upward. They were very thick, and it was put out quickly. Those trees were maybe 30 feet from the Midway stream crossing. Lightning strike, they figured. October 1987, 10 p.m. A night hiker walking the run as the endpoint of a 40-miler that had started in Gareth saw an orange glow around a slight bend in the trail and came across those same 2 trees ablaze again, just the tops. He didn't know what to do, so he just moved as fast as he could down the run, not reaching town for another 25 minutes. Despite that long stretch of time, the fire never worked down those birches very far, and the uppermost forks were charred but still intact after the fire was put out. 2 freak fires striking the tops of 2 trees that seemed to guard the stream crossing so close to the spot where Vivian Clevitt disappeared. They became locally famous, of course. People would stop and point up at the permanently blackened tops and take pictures. It only made sense to fashion some story tied to the disappearance. Were those trees ever analyzed? I don't know. In November of 1988, there was a false report of a 3rd fire, but it's important to note that it wouldn't be proven false until several weeks later. Before that, on November 14th, 5 days after the faulty report that everyone assumed was true, a 12-year-old boy and his 18-year-old sister happened to walk past the Midway stream crossing at noon. And they saw a man sitting there looking strange, they said. Drunk, maybe. They said hi, but he said nothing. They remembered he had a big milk jug beside his left arm, but it was filled with something different, something dark. And the sister said she detected a whiff of gasoline, but she couldn't be sure. That night a ranger in Gulport saw the glow of a fire and started running from a station a mile away, calling the fire in. This one was real. A man was hanging by a homemade noose from a high branch on one of the 2 birches near the crossing, burning brightly. Nothing but a husk by the time the ranger got near him, almost tripping over the empty milk jug. Barry Clevitt had flown across the country and gone directly from the airport to the Lyra forest. Nobody knew how he spent his time there between being seen at noon and being found at 8:14 p.m. when he immolated himself, his body falling naturally from its perch as the flames devoured him. No note of confession, though, and no more evidence was ever found of foul play. Whether what killed him in such a weird display was remorse, fear, or some ghastly mental shade of night that cloaked his mind because of an urban legend that seemed to be calling to him, probably nobody will ever know. I know the details of the third story I sometimes tell about the forest because I was there. I had a girlfriend, Rose. She was a little crazy. Very outdoorsy. Her big fascination was delving off into places she suspected no human foot had ever trod. She liked to think she was the first person ever to touch a certain tree or put her foot at a certain remote spot in a remote stream. A real pioneer. We were camping overnight in the Grays in January, about as far away from everyone as you can get in the entire state. And as we made our way back in the morning through some new snow, 3 inches or so, she thought it would be great fun to veer wildly off an unmarked side trail down a tremendous slope and bushwhack in search of unknown territory. I followed her, slipping and sliding, until we realistically couldn't go any deeper into the woods without getting very badly lost. We were in a kind of ugly, tree-choked valley, huge rocks everywhere. The slopes were quite nasty. There was truly no reason to ever go down there because the climb back up was just not worth the effort. Rose stopped, finally, thank God, and said, "Here we are, maybe the only humans ever to sit on this rock." And as we sat there, I spotted a thick maze of more dense trees in the distance, with a weird dark spot in the middle. We went over to check it out. It was a cabin, the smallest one I'd ever seen. Time and weather had gone to work on it pretty brutally. It looked unstable, every board starting to rot. The roof was caved partly in. But of course Rose had to open the door, which was attached by one good hinge, and one that completely fell off right there and then. Inside was a tiny central room with a broken wood stove in 3 pieces, and one other room closed off by a door. No furniture, no anything. The place smelled like spoiled fruit. Felt like the place hadn't been entered in years and years. Rose spotted some paper on the door to what I supposed was a bedroom. It was a third of a single page from an old newspaper, nailed into the door at eye level. Someone had written over the newsprint with a lot of effort, having to retrace the letters again and again to make them legible in pencil. The words said, "Call the police." I took the page in my fingers, trying not to crumble it by accident. It was gray and stiff, and little edge bits of it fell away. The article on the back of the page, what was left of it, was about the proposed building of an overpass near my house, and that overpass had finally been constructed 9 years before. Rose went to turn the doorknob, but the cabin was so cheaply built that there wasn't one at all. The door would have swung inward freely, but something was jamming it. It was the rest of the newspaper, plus an old copy of Sports Illustrated, plus 4 different maps of the area, and it had all been jammed underneath the door to wedge it shut. And the dampness over the years had fused that paper there more firmly. Not just paper either, but random shavings and little daggers of wood, some of which looked like it had been whittled for just this purpose. Even an old leather wallet, which was now empty. All of it creating a very firm impediment to opening the door. Together we threw our weight again and again against the door. It simply never gave at the bottom. But what did happen was that the years of rot splintered the whole thing until a giant chunk of it just fell inward. I kicked the rest of it in and we stepped through. The only object in this little room was a wooden chair, and there was a body in it, strapped to the chair, with layer upon layer of fishing line. The body had rotted away down to the skeleton, and collapsed sideways where it was, but the bones had remained intact. No clothes at all on it, not a stitch. The body was enormous, that much was clear. Some man of great height, upwards of 7 feet tall, I think. In another few years, maybe the skull would simply fall off onto the floor, or the rib cage would collapse. The skull's eye sockets were much, much bigger than a normal human being's. I can't say anything else about it was grossly unusual except for the teeth. They all pointed toward the center of the mouth and were very sharp. We left that cabin and we made our way up the slope, exhausted and panting. And we left the Lyra forest. And we talked about what we should do next. Well, what I did is hike back there the very next day alone. I clambered down the slope again, slipping and sliding. In that tiny room I started a small fire right on the planks, and all alone I burned the skeleton, using the stray maps and pulp and wood shavings and the remains of the door as kindling.
I love the Lyra forest, you see. I find it beautiful. There have been so many terrible things that have happened there over the years, and so many things that people thought happened but never really did. I just don't see the need to add to the cruel urban legends. I like to walk there in winter, alone, especially after a new snow falls, and listen to the way it runs into the tiny streams I've known since I was 7 years old. Several years ago, I went to a party down in Richmond. Got out of there insanely late, like 4 in the morning. And I started driving back to D.C. The first 15 miles of Route 1 were just this country straightaway, cutting between the woods. And about 15 minutes into the drive, the headlights picked out a man standing on the shoulder, facing me, not waving me down or anything, just standing there. It's like 30 degrees outside. We were miles away from anything. So I figured, drunk, hopefully not about to wander out into the middle of the road. I kept going, just trying to keep my eyes open. About 5 miles later, there was another person standing on the shoulder, just like he was, facing me, not in distress. It was a woman this time. She was holding something. Couldn't really see what. Her clothes struck me as kind of strange, just very dark from head to toe as I rolled past. And I considered, braking, but, I just really needed to get home, or probably to a hotel. I wasn't going to make it. I reached over and I turned the radio on full blast, trying to sing along with it, but nothing was really working. I just went faster, actually. And less than 2 miles later, I saw another person standing on the shoulder. It was a little girl this time. She had blonde hair, and she was holding like a big jug, like a clay jug, I want to say. And this time, I swerved over to the shoulder, stopped the car. I looked in the rearview mirror, and just in the time it took me to pull over, she had vanished. She had gone into the woods as if she were afraid of me or something. So I left the car running, and I got out, had the flashers on, went around to the back of the car, looked into the woods. Nothing there. The very first gray light of dawn was cracking in the sky. Just this gray, dark gray light, just so I could see my hand in front of my face and some shapes in the woods. Not much else. And I figured, okay, I'll just stand here for a little while, and the little girl will be able to see the glow of the flashers. So if she needs help, she will come and get help. This is all I can do. It was so cold out, and she hadn't been wearing a jacket of any kind. So she never came, and I figured, okay, I'll go about 30, 40 yards into the woods. So I did. I stepped off the shoulder and started walking through the dead leaves, parted the tree line, walked forward, couldn't really see much of anything. I got a really bad scratch right about here from a low-hanging branch. I kept going, and then I finally saw something kind of big up ahead. It was a table, just sitting there, not even in a clearing or anything, just sitting there amongst the dead trees all around in the grass. And around this table, which looked really rickety and handmade, like it had been put together from mismatched pieces of wood. Around the table were these 3 chairs, also visibly handmade. 2 of them were kind of normal sized, and one was noticeably much smaller. And there was a tablecloth over the surface. It looked absolutely ancient, as if I were to touch it, it would just crumble into dust. It was so thin. And there was a jug there right in the middle of the table. Its handle was broken off. There were also 3 plates set around. 2 of them were shattered. Cups, clay cups, they were empty. Also, chipped away and old. One of them was on its side. And on a serving tray, more like a cutting board, were the remains of some meal animal, something big that had maybe been caught in the woods. It's like a raccoon or something. I was looking at its rib cage. It looked just as ancient as everything else. And on all of these things, pine needles and grime and dirt, just years and years of what the time passing in the woods had done to these things. And I looked at them, and I waited for someone to come and explain them. But no one ever did. I finally got so cold I turned and I went back to my car and I drove away. And I've never been back to that place. I would never be able to find the exact spot anyway. And people will say, well, that in itself it probably meant nothing. There's no evidence that it had any meaning. And I kind of remember the exact day last winter that I myself had finally reached that point where I thought, yeah, it didn't mean anything. Not 24 hours after I finally felt that thought in my mind, I was riding in a friend's car. In the passenger seat, we were up outside of Scranton at around midnight. There was a big full moon in the sky, and it had begun to snow. And at one point she said to me, "Oh, look over that field over there. It's really sticking." And I turned my head to the right, and I saw in that field, as far as the eye could see, hundreds of yards in every possible direction, there were animal bones. All shapes and sizes, every kind of animal. The snow was falling on spines and ribs and skulls and claws. There was just no end to them. As we rolled past, the snow coming down on all these things. I said to my driver, I said, "Stop the car." And just in the time that she did, it had all vanished. There was nothing there now but the field itself. The entire vision had lasted maybe 3 seconds. But that was when I knew that those people had been ghosts. Almost everyone has that one person in their old group who drifts away for the wrong reasons. For us, it was Chad. In the years since high school, there were just worse and worse decisions and drugs and habitual lies, some arrests, depression. He kind of faded away, and after a while, really none of us made any effort to bring him back. Then one night out of the blue, a couple of years ago, he called me late at night, and he said he had a problem that he thought only I would really be able to understand sympathetically. So I wound up driving out to meet him in a 24-hour diner, like 11 o'clock. He was looking pretty bad. My old best friend from 7th grade. He had with him an old answering machine that he'd gotten somewhere. He only had a landline. And he wanted to play me 2 messages he'd gotten on it. Both times they'd come in when he was on the other side of the house and kind of not able to get to the phone. This had happened in the house that he'd inherited from his grandmother. Here was the first message.
Let me out. Let me out. Hey, Mr. Popcorn. I'm down in the cellar. Time to come out.
His machine didn't record numbers. Chad said the weird thing about it was that when he played that message that night, he'd actually been holding a bag of store-bought popcorn in one hand. He checked around the house and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. He went down to the cellar. Nothing there. So he was a little freaked out, but otherwise okay. The very next night, though, the machine beeped again. And again, he wasn't able to get to it before it left a second message.
Let me out. Let me out. Cellar's cold. Blue sock, white sock. I have your story ready. Let me out.
Chad had listened to that one 5 or 6 times trying to figure it out. Only when he went to bed an hour later and he was changing into some sweatpants did he realize that all day he'd been wearing one blue sock and one white sock. He hadn't gone out that day. It was Sunday. That made him very nervous. So now he was telling me that he really kind of wanted to spend the night at my place. He just didn't feel safe somehow in his own. I said, oh, okay. So he followed me back 20 miles to my house. He brought the answering machine with him, and he crashed overnight. I went to work the next day. When I got back, he was still there, which I was not crazy about, and he seems very nervous, and he said to me, look, I'm sorry, if you could just do one more thing for me, I promise I won't bother you with this again. He wanted me to come back to his house with him and just kind of walk through it, just to make sure nothing was there, nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't know what to say. I thought if this would be the end of it, then I would go. So we drove on back. His grandmother's place was going to seed under his care. It was dirty and random junk was everywhere. He'd been trying to resell anything and everything on eBay, stuff he'd gotten at yard sales or Craigslist curb alerts. He and I walked together through every room. The mess continued in the cellar, which was at the bottom of a freakishly steep and unstable wooden stairwell. Down there was just a pile of old records and tapes and games and crafts and clothing and lawn equipment, sporting equipment. To soothe his mind, I even made a show of checking behind the furnace in a 2-foot crawl space. He said he probably wouldn't ever plug the machine back in, and he'd be okay now. Maybe he'd call the police and tell them what was going on, but maybe not. Driving back home, this sad thought began to crystallize in my mind as I played those messages again and again in my imagination, and the thought was that the voice on the tape sounded to me like it was Chad trying to mimic something. I didn't understand the psychology of it then, but I figured maybe it hit a low point where he was so desperate for attention and validation that he would actually do something this bizarre. And then when I got home, I discovered that there was like $100 missing from a drawer where I kept money for when the lawn service came around every couple of weeks. And I figured, okay, don't make a big deal of it. Maybe $100 is now the price you pay for never having to speak to Chad again. Maybe it's time to pay that price. About 11:30 that night, I woke up. My cell phone was ringing. I let it go and I checked the message. It was Chad. He was begging me to drive back over to his house. He sounded drunk. He said he had a new message and he didn't know what to do. He'd wait up for me. I called him back, but he didn't pick up. I laid awake for another half hour, and then I got out of bed. And yeah, I drove up to Crown Corner. His house was dark. His front door was unlocked. Nobody came when I knocked, so I went in. No lights were on inside whatsoever. I walked down a short hallway to the only bedroom. The door was open. The covers of the bed were rumpled, but Chad wasn't in there. I called out to him every 30 seconds or so as I explored. In the kitchen, the answering machine was plugged back in. It was on the counter. I went over to it and I pressed the new messages button.
Sleeping there like a stick. Let me out down here. Let me out before he comes. I'll have your story ready. Answer me.
Even before the message ended, I heard footsteps. I backed out into the hallway. At the very end of it was the closed door that led to the cellar. The steps I heard were unusually slow and methodical, and they seemed to pause near the top, and I registered the fact that there was no dim glow of fluorescent light seeping under the floor. It was totally dark behind it. That creaky stained door opened, and Chad came through, staring at me blankly, unshaven and looking exhausted or inebriated. Wobbly, he was balancing precariously at the top of the staircase. He was holding something in each hand. He looked at me and he said, "I didn't even mean to buy it. It was part of a lot at an estate sale." I asked him what was going on. In response, he only looked down at his right hand, which held a metal coffee can, then back up at me, and then, as if he were a diver, he threw his weight backwards all at once with as much force as he had left in his body, leaving his feet and plummeting into the dark as I screamed at the top of my lungs. I heard his body hit the steps just once before he careened clear of them and struck the cement floor, even before I managed to pull the chain which turned the lights on. I think Chad died instantly. His stare seemed to be frozen forever on a set of old golf clubs near his head. Blood had pooled all around it. The coffee can he'd been holding had skittered across the floor, and a plastic lid he'd been holding in his left hand was pinned beneath his hip. When I was certain Chad was dead, I stood and I took a closer look at the walls all around me. The writing had started in one corner near the ceiling and wrapped around every wall, and then looped around and around again and again in letters 5 or 6 inches high, sentence after sentence, likely made by a black marker found later among all the junk down there. More than 1,300 words in handwriting that was eerily normal. 1,300 words telling the story of Chad's life, not from his birth, but beginning seemingly from that very night, projecting a detailed future he didn't have the strength to face. The first words read, "You will injure a mother in a car accident on the 9th of October. And it went on to describe any number of freakishly specific crimes and minor disasters the nameless scribe predicted Chad would perpetrate, including dates and locations, and that story on the walls culminated with his suicide, described in the final sentence, which ran behind the water heater in the cellar's east corner. "You will hang yourself at dawn in a campground," it said. There's little other explanation for the writing other than the words were written by Chad himself. No handwriting analysis was ever made, and the rough surface of the cinder blocks which made up the walls would have made it too difficult anyway, I figure. I don't know, though. Here's what he was holding when he jumped to his death. An empty, rusty can of Folgers coffee, and a plastic lid that was crisscrossed with very short strips of black electrical tape. The tape had, until recently, clung fast to the outer rim of the can. You could feel the stickiness there for several inches and see the threads all around where Chad had pried the tape away with what was probably a great deal of effort. On the little bit of untapped space on the lid were letters very different from the ones on the cellar walls. Unmistakably childlike writing. Block capitals in felt-tip marker that read, "Careful. Do not ever open." I close this story with something I found not long ago in the 6th Dictionary of Occult Manifestation, first published in 1822. It's the definition of something called a pyctid. Pyktid. It's a type of poltergeist that tends to concentrate its destructive games on a single attack against its prey, and is also known to cleverly construct lies and false evidence in order to induce paranoia and terror. A couple of years ago, I took some time off to try to hike a 500-mile section of the Appalachian Trail, starting out near Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. As you walk along, there's a natural grapevine that forms among all the other hikers. And just 3 days into my trip, word came down the line that some hiker up near Waynesboro had been attacked by a black bear on the trail, which is actually an extremely rare occurrence. The details were sketchy, but the word was that he was right back on the AT already after being treated for his injuries. I became a little bit obsessed with this when I started out the next morning. I was doing 15 or 16 miles a day all alone on the trail. Sometimes a whole day would go by, you wouldn't see any other humans. And if you start to get paranoid like that, every twig, every shifting in the underbrush sounds like something threatening, and it can drive you crazy.
Just 4 days later, I arrived at a shelter somewhere near Shippensburg, and there was kind of a buzz among the southbound hikers who were stopping for the night. A guy started to tell me the story of a northbound hiker who'd been attacked by a black bear, but the details were all wrong. And I realized he was talking about a separate incident. We went back and forth until it became obvious he was insisting the same hiker was involved. We got together with some other people at the shelter and went over the facts that some people knew. It seemed to be true, but impossible. The same hiker attacked twice within a week and injured both times. Most people adopt an informal trail name out there when they're going all the way to the end, and this guy referred to himself apparently as Claudius. The consensus among us was that he must have been doing something wrong, maybe even hunting, for this to happen. It just could not be. No one knew what happened to him after he walked out of the woods to the hospital in Boiling Springs. The area was filled with bears, but they were generally docile, afraid of humans, so what was the story? When Sunday came around, I was up around that area. I made the mistake of pushing past one shelter to try to make it to one further along, and when dusk fell, I was still on the trail, which was an unsettling feeling. I had a headlamp, but I didn't want to be out there so late. By the time I finally got to the next shelter, I was on my last legs, and it was almost full dark. I came around the front of it. These things were just 3 walls and a roof. And a man was sitting with his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, drinking water slowly from a jug. He had a shaved head, was kind of muscular, looked maybe 50. I sat down on the other side of the platform and we said hello, and I started in with the usual polite queries. Are you going all the way through? What's your hike been like? He'd gotten a late start in the season, so he was headed to Maine from the Shenandoahs. He said his name was Claudius. Of course it was, because on the left side of his face were a dozen big, ugly stitches going all the way down his cheek, under his jaw. And his right elbow was wrapped in several layers of gauze as if protecting some injury. I had to inquire about the obvious. He spoke very softly and almost serenely. He confirmed that yes, less than 2 weeks into his hike, he had been attacked not once, but twice. The first time he had accidentally surprised a bear behind a rock, a fluke thing, and it had reacted badly, and so had he. It had stepped on his arm and clawed at his foot before he made enough noise to scare it enough for a retreat. And then a few days ago came the inexplicable nighttime attack. There had been a bear crouching near a spring just past dusk, and Claudius had gone into a kind of shock, forgot to make noise, forgot not to make eye contact, and it had charged. Again, deeply strange behavior. That time nothing seemed to scare the bear, and he believed he had been very close to being fatally mauled, until he lashed out just so with one of his hiking poles and gotten the bear in the eye. He said you could probably still see the blood if you went that way. He said it with no drama, no special emphasis, just looking out into the dark woods as if expecting to see something there. I tried to lighten the mood by asking him what he did for a living, and he smiled a strange smile and said he'd been piecing an existence together for a few years. But then nothing had seemed to work, and he figured the trail was a place he could go where his string of bad luck couldn't find him. Now he was thinking that it was out of control, that he was caught in a whirlpool of it. That's how he phrased it. No way out of the whirlpool. He'd been up For 44 years, he said. But for the last 2, it had been down, down, down. He just sort of trailed off, smiling. He said, "It's really kind of funny." I wasn't laughing. Jesus. He said, "Look at this." And he unzipped his pack and he brought out an undersized playing card and he showed it to me. He said, "Do you know the tarot?" I did, actually, a little bit. He was showing me the Tower, which in itself doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. But he said it had come up for him in a certain spot 3 times in a row just before he'd started his hike. I said, "How about trying it again now?" And he smiled sadly again and said, "Didn't want to bring the cards, it adds weight." But he'd kept